Oh, it's just so great to have you all here today. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Julia Lee. I'm an assistant professor of management and organizations at the Ross School of Business. And almost about a year ago, I think it was February of 2017, I have given a talk about how to become our best selves and how to bring your best selves to work. And that was right after I decided to stay here as faculty after my postdoc. And so I started this wonderful journey as a new faculty here last summer. And I can report back to you today that was the best decision I have ever made. So thank you. So enough about me, but let me introduce the Center for Positive Organizations as well. We are a community of students, of practitioners, and of faculty who are trying to push the frontier to understand what cultivates flourishing and thriving in individuals and organizations. So that's what we do at the center. Let me ask you a quick question before I get to the next. How many of you are attending this speaker series for the first time? Raise your hand. Wow, wow. Hazel, you brought a lot of newcomers to this space. This is amazing. I'm very excited about that. The purpose of this speaker series is to invite scholars who do cutting-edge research in this area to translate some of their research into practice. So thank you for being here with us today. I hope that you make a habit of attending this speaker series in the future. Before I introduce her, I would like to acknowledge the generous support from our sponsors. First of all, Diane and Paul Johns. Paul is here today. Diane is unfortunately not here today, but they have been generously sponsoring this speaker series since its beginning. And I was surprised to find that they have been meeting with the speakers every month, and that involved driving here from Grand Rapids. And so thank you again for sponsoring us. Please give them a round of applause. In addition, I would like to thank University of Michigan Learning and Professional Development, Zenger Leadership Center, Tauber Institute for Global Operations, and Samuel Zell and Robert Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies for sponsoring this series. All right, I'm pretty nervous because I'm also very starstruck by having Dr. Markus here today. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Hazel Markus. Dr. Markus is the Davis Bragg Professor in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She co-directs the Stanford SPARK, which stands for Social Psychological Answers to Real-World Questions, and directs Stanford's Research Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. She received her PhD from University of Michigan, so go blue, and served on our faculty in social psychology between 1975 and 1994 before she moved to Stanford. And so while she was on the faculty, I heard from Jane Dutton, the co-founder of the Center for Positive Organizations, that she was the one who welcomed Jane and Lance into our community. And so I can sort of see how that is a gift that keeps on giving. And so I felt very welcome into this community when I first joined. So thank you for starting that transition. Dr. Markus is one of the best scholars in psychological science today, and I'm not exaggerating this. She is the best. She's the most influential, the world-renowned psychologist, and she quite literally created, she's a pioneer in the field of cultural psychology, and she inspired many generations of future behavioral scientists, including myself. And as a researcher, I admire her work so much that I jumped at the opportunity to bringing her over here for this speaker series. She's widely respected for her research on how cultures shape selves and on the role of selves in regulating behavior. So her most recent book, Clash, is about two ways of being, independent versus interdependent. So this book also tells us about how this cultural difference shapes everything from how we run our governments to how we raise our children. So we have a lot to learn from her today. So today she will share her insights on how to thrive in a multicultural world. Please join me welcome Dr. Hazel Markus. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Julia, for that really generous, wonderful introduction. I'm thrilled to be here today. As Julia said, I started at the University of Michigan. It is simply the most positive organization that I know about as universities go. And so it's not surprising to me that it is the seat of the Center for Positive Organizations. And I've just in my time here today, have a feeling of what it does. And I am so pleased to be invited, and thank you for that. I want to start by telling you that my most recent impetus for this talk has been at the work that we have done at Spark, as Julia said, social psychological answers to real world questions. And what we do, I'm not ready for that yet, what we do is to bring together researchers, social psychologists, and practitioners, and our goal is to get more of the real world into our science and also more of the science into the real world. And we do this through research clinics where we bring practitioners in health, in education, in criminal justice, in organizational development together with social psychologists, and we talk about what problems they have that we might be able to help them with. And one problem that we found across these domains is practitioners telling us that in these increasingly diverse world, that they find that the people that they're teaching, the people that they're trying to manage, the people that they're trying to care for, are different than they thought, and things just aren't working. And do we have any ideas that could be helpful to them? And one of the things I want to talk about today is the need to understand behavior that doesn't fit what we'll call mainstream behavior, and how useful that can be in bridging cultural divides. So to start that, let me give you a couple of quizzes. Okay. So I want to start off by saying your mom is in town, she's visiting, you come home and you find out that your house is on fire, and inside your mother is asleep in one bedroom and your spouse is asleep in the other bedroom. I'm sorry, but these are very important positive links, and you have only time to save one, okay? So you can't do both, you just have to save one. I want to see a show of hands. How many people, top of your head, would save their spouse? Raise your hands. Raise your hands, save your spouse. Or their spouses in the room. Raise your hand, save your spouse. You've got to answer. Come on, come on. Okay, if you don't have a spouse, you're too young. Okay, hands down. Let me see how many would save their mom. There's their mom. Okay, let's see, we've got more spouse, but there's quite a few moms in the room. Okay, so I'm going to show you the data from a recent study that compared American, in this case Taiwanese, Chinese, and what you can see is that most Americans, like most people in this room, say spouse. Why? You chose your spouse. A spouse is a reflection of your preferences, right? On the other hand, most Taiwanese say, my mother, of course. My mother gave me life. You can always get another spouse. And so it's very clear, and this is a study that's been replicated with multiple conditions in various ages. Okay, quiz one. Here's quiz number two. I want to give you a gift. You're such a nice audience, and I'm going to give you a free pen. Okay, I want you to choose which pen you want. And you can see that 4 are of one color and 1 is of a different color, okay? Let me see a show of hands. How many people would pick the green pen? Okay, look around, let's see, okay. How many people, hands down, would pick the orange pen? That's kind of interesting. That looks more like half and half. I should be able to count. Let me show you the data. What you can see is that most Americans with European background, most Americans say they would pick the pen that's in the minority, the green pen, the unique pen. Most East Asians, and this is true across Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, multiple studies, they would pick the pen that's in the majority, the one that there's the most of that pen. Okay, so now, yes?
You gotta know where you are. Indiana or Michigan?
Yes, I do know. I'll get there. You'll see. We're getting there in a minute. You'll see that. Very, very good. So most, and you'll see what we say about that in a minute. You can see that most Americans, it's behavior that we can pretty much explain. Okay, so when it comes to who you would save, you say my spouse. I chose my spouse. You know, that's the person I'm going to make my life with. When it comes to a pen, I want something that's a little bit different, something that stands out from others. The other behavior, the behavior that's more common in East Asian context, might be something that's a little bit less clear to people, a little bit more difficult for them to understand. Why could that be? What's the reason there? And I think that there are, of course, many differences between the East and the West. Many, and if you really want to know about the sources of these differences, I'll point over here to two of my collaborators, Professor Shinobu Kitayama and Professor Mayumi Karasawa, who have been my guides and collaborators to understanding about the East versus West. And I would also say that Professor Shinobu Kitayama is going to give a lecture on Wednesday called East versus West. So if you want really about the sources of that, look out for that lecture on Wednesday. He's going to become an LSNA collegiate professor. One of the big important reasons that we've talked about is the differences between your theory or your model or your blueprint for how to be a person, how to be a self. And one important understanding of self that will help you make sense of why East Asians might say my mother, I would save my mother, or might pick the pen that's in the majority, it's because of more practice with what we call the interdependent self or the we self. This is, people in East Asian contexts are likely to have much more practice and familiarity with this way of being. What you see is you're in the middle, surrounded by important others in your life. That's true for all selves. That's how we make selves. But what's central to an interdependent self is what's in the dotted red line there. That is relationships with other people. So it's creating and maintaining those relationships that make the self. And then, of course, when that's the self that's guiding behavior, that's directing behavior, and selves matter because they guide and direct all of our behavior, what's important to do is to adjust, to fit in with others, if you're connected to others, your actions make a difference from them in all cases. And interdependent selves are much more likely to have a holistic view because of these relationships with others, and they are therefore concerned about their place, how they are connected to others, rooted in place, in history, in tradition. Interdependent selves, when you're taking this perspective on the self, you're also much more likely to be aware of where you are in a hierarchy, where you fit. So, for example, in East Asian worlds, you are aware that you were in a social hierarchy where your parents came first, and honoring that hierarchy is something that's very important for you to do. Now, that's one blueprint for how to be a self. There are other ways to be a self, of course, and compare it with the independent self, which is over here on the left in blue. What you can see, once again, there's you in the middle, surrounded by others, but the task of being a self is somewhat different. It is, in fact, to recognize that one is a little bit separate and different from others, to not be unduly influenced by others, but in fact to be expressing oneself. And in fact, what's in the middle there, what's central to this self is the blue part, what's inside, one's attitudes, one's attributes, one's preferences. That's what makes up the independent self. And an independent self, freedom is very important. Freedom from, so you should be free from others, from tradition, from place, from history. That shouldn't influence you too much. You're separate from that. And you should also be free to, what you'd be free to do, free to choose, to express what you want. So you can see that depending on which one of these selves was guiding your behavior, was animating your actions at the time, why you might choose to save your mother, why you might choose the orange pen, or instead why you might choose to save your spouse and try and pick the green pen as your first preference. Okay, now there are other theories of self. These are two prominent ones. The interdependent self, understanding the interdependent self, developing that self, and using that self is one way to bridge some of the big cultural divides that we have today, and that's the message that I want to leave you with. Oh, is it? Yeah, she's, oh, it can't hear? Okay. Okay, is this better? Yes. Oh, sorry. Okay, do I have to start over? There's no time to start over. All right. What my point here, these are two models of self, two blueprints of how to be a self. The one that is the default in our mainstream American context is this one here, this independent self. Okay. Now, why is that the default model? Why is that the one that our social sciences know everything about and the way we sort of think is the good and the best way to be a self? One of the reasons is, and many of you have heard this, I hope that you have, is that what we have discovered is that psychology is really quite weird. And not just psychology, the social sciences. And the social sciences are weird. What do we mean? They are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Okay, so it means that in our social sciences, we know a lot about the weird people in the world. In fact, the weirdest people in the world, because the weirds are about 85% of the world's population. And it's not just the rest of the world, within the United States as well, many people could be counted as not weird. So we understand about this model of self as independent. We have much less understanding about the model of self that is directing behavior for most of the people in most of the world. So quickly, what I want to say about these, your two selves. First of all, everyone has both an independent and interdependent self, and you could probably see this in this room. You may have one self that's more useful to you at home and a different one in the workplace. In our workplaces, in our universities, in our workplaces, it's the independent self that is the one that's required, and it's the one that's baked into the policies and the practices and the routines. Both of these selves are equally valuable. They're both good ways to be, and very importantly, they both have their upsides and their downsides. A lot of work seems to suggest in our social sciences that maybe the independent way is the most evolved or the best or the most developed way. It's a way, there's a lot of good stuff that's associated with it, but it's only a way. And there are other ways to be, and the interdependent way is not a secondary or a less good or a way to be if you have time for it. It's an essential part, and I can see that in the work here in the Center for Positive Organizations that interdependence and appreciation of interdependence is very much there from the start. And what I want to say today is that depending on your cultural background, you are likely to use one of these selves more than the others, and you're likely to have had more practice and familiarity with one of these selves than the others. So, and when that happens, when you get people who have engaged in contexts where interdependence is the more common and useful way to be, and they enter into settings like most of our formal institutions in mainstream America, our universities and our workplaces, that are built on an independent model of self, what you get is clash. You get miscommunication, you get misunderstanding, you get conflicts of all sorts. And I just tried to give you two little simple examples of the East-West difference of things that people might not understand. In a book that I did with a colleague, Elena Connor, called Clash, we looked at a number of these cultural divides and tried to show how you could explain them, many, many differences, but how you could explain them, at least in part, through understanding the difference between thinking about this independent way of being versus an interdependent way of being, and how being aware of these differences and making accommodations for them can be helpful. Okay, so I put a worksheet on everybody's desk here, and what I'm going to do is just ask for a show of hands because there isn't time to do the worksheet, but I'm going to ask you to think about your own cultural mix, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you identify with one or another, or you can put up both hands if you identify with both. So for example, I'm clearly a product of the West, but thanks to my collaborators, I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in the East, so I actually identify with East and West. So I would put up both of my arms when I ask for this. Some of you may not identify with either of these contexts. I'm trying to, get an overall sense of your identifying cultural context. So, same for men and women. I identify as a woman, but for most of my life, I spent my world in a context with a lot of men. Things are changing, but I would put up both hands for men and women in terms of context that I identify with. Okay, so raise your hand if you, and look around as you're doing it because I want us to see the nature of the room. Raise your hand if you identify with the West. Okay, what about the East? East, okay, how about both? Okay, that's quite a number. Okay, men, raise your hand if you identify with the context of men. Raise your hand. It's a fraught one these days, but it's okay. Raise your hand. All right. All right, raise your hand if you identify with women, context of women. I hope you're looking around at everyone else. Okay, what about both? Okay, a lot. Oh, very good. Okay, how about whites? Identify with white cultural context. A lot of white people in the room. Okay, how about people of color? How many identify with people of color? Both, hands up. Okay, it's a lot, it's a lot. Middle class, how many people identify with being middle class? Okay, how many people identify with being working class? And of course, hands up if you identify with both. You used to be one and now you're the other. Yeah, okay, how about, you can see how we're going. Let's do the East and West Coast. Either East or West Coast, put your hand up. Okay. Hands down. Well, if you identify with the heartland where we are now or the South, put your hand up. Okay, both. Very good. Okay, well, so I won't go all the way down the list because I've got a lot to say, but what I want you to see is that, first of all, these are the contexts that are most likely to promote independence. If you have had experience in those contexts, you are likely to have an independent self, to have had practice with being an independent self. On the other hand, and you can do your score sheet, if you have spent more time in the, on the red side, on the independent side, you are likely to have more practice with using your interdependent self. And some of you may be perfectly balanced. Some of you, I could see by the number of hands up in the room that were both, you may have both an elaborated interdependent self and elaborated independent self, and you're in luck because that's the combination I think that will help you thrive and help other people thrive in the diverse world. So a few cultural takeaways from our cultural mix here. Exercise. Everyone in here, I think you could see, is multicultural. So we're all multicultural, just looking at the array of hands that were up. We're all a mix, an intersection of many, many different cultural contexts. But it is interesting to look at your own patterning and to see if you've spent more of your time in independent contexts or more in interdependent. Both people, most of us are interacting with both of these cultural contexts most of the time. And most of us are identifying with two contexts that are clashing. Now, I want to talk quickly about where do these independent and interdependent theories of the self come from. There's many, many different sources of them. They, of course, come from our cultures, and there are many ways to define cultures. Here we define them as the ideas, interactions, institutions, and that guide individuals in thinking, feeling, and acting. So the 4I definition of culture. And these 4 layers or levels fit together into a dynamic that we call the culture cycle. And very often in the social sciences, we focus over here on individuals, but it's important to, I could get this to where you can see it, if you can get it to individual thoughts, feelings, mindsets, biases. Often we're putting a lot of attention to the individual in organizational behavior and in psychology. But what's, of course, essential to recognize is that individual is not separate, but indeed part of his or her many culture cycles. And culture cycles include your interactions with other people, with groups, with norms, with artifacts. Those interactions that are your daily interactions at home, at school, at work are themselves organized by these larger formal institutions. All sorts of formal institutions are important in our lives: government, science, religion, the media, of course. And then underneath all of this, undergirding a lot of it in our various cultural cycles, are big ideas about what counts, what's good, what's the way to be a self, what does it mean to be moral, what does it mean to be good in one way or another. So these culture cycles are there for all of our important cultural contexts, and you can think of each one of us as a node in an intersecting set of many, many culture cycles that are giving us a sense of who we are and guiding how we behave. Now, US American culture cycles foster independence, and that's why this independent self is the default self for most of us. And now, depending on where you've spent your time and the kinds of experiences you have, you may have more experience with interdependence yourself. But my point for today is that our mainstream institutions, and I'll give you the examples of our universities and our workplaces, are built on independence, and we need to find a way to incorporate more interdependence. And I'm going to give you an example of these cultural divides, a little bit West and East, and then a little bit working class and middle class, and I'll go quickly. So first, East and West. I want to start with one of my first experiences with this real clash of somebody with an interdependent self coming into an independent environment, which was a student at Stanford. She was a graduate student, Hee-Jung Kim. She came from Korea. She's now a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I couldn't get her to talk in the seminar, no matter what I did. I called on her. I told her, next week I'm going to call on you. She just wouldn't talk. And then one day I noticed at the bottom of her email, the signature line, it said this: "The empty carriage rattles the loudest," which of course was Hee-Jung's way of saying to me that very often the people that have the most to say, are busy expressing themselves all the time, often have the least going on, actually have the, and so she, this was, as I got to know Hee-Jung Kim and I got to understand her culture cycle, and what she had experienced growing up, I found out, for example, that she had grown up in classrooms that looked a lot like this. This is where students are supposed to sit calmly with quiet minds, trying to receive the information from the person who's higher in the hierarchy. Remember, being aware of hierarchy is important for an interdependent self. That's the professor. The knowledge comes from the professor through to the student. There is a time for questioning, of course, but that comes after you've absorbed information. Most of the other students in that class, when I couldn't get Hee-Jung to talk, had grown-ups in classrooms that looked more like this. And this is where students are, competing with each other to get called on, and they're looking for a chance to hone their unique ideas, to express themselves, to even debate with the teacher or with the other students to clarify their ideas. And in fact, in our mainstream independent institutions, we call that critical thinking. And that's clearly the right way to think. Hee-jung went on to do a really wonderful set of, well, I should say before that, these ideas are, they have lots of cultural underpinning if you're trying to understand where they come from in the cultural cycle. So in the West, of course, we're rooted in a Cartesian philosophy. I think, therefore I am. You couldn't have a more clear statement of what's important in being a self than this, an independent self. From an Eastern perspective, there's a very different idea about what's important to be a good self. From a Confucian perspective, shown here, it's filial piety. It's honoring those that gave you life, that came before you, that are part of the overall, the encompassing whole that you're part of. No surprise that you would save your mother if you grew up in a culture cycle that fostered this. And of course, this is in everyday ways. These ideas are carried out throughout the culture cycle. In the West, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. What do they say in the East? The duck that makes the most noise gets shot. So you can see standing out is, it could be good. We independent selves know that, but it also can make you vulnerable. That's why it might be safe to pick the orange pen, the one that there's the most of, because of course, other people have it. Standing out can be a source of problems. And this is perpetuated throughout the culture cycle in many different ways. You look at ads, so this is the new iPhone that's out. American ads for this show one person walking around by herself enjoying her iPhone. If you look, a Korean ad from Samsung, new phone out at the same time, every ad shows many people together enjoying their iPhones, using it to take pictures of people together. Just multiple ways that the culture cycle fosters. This is the way to be interdependent, connected in relation to others, or instead, this is the way to be more standing out and being on your own, being an individual. So Hee-jung went on to do a really interesting set of studies to show that for Koreans, and other Asians, even people who grow up with English as their first language, Asian Americans, that talking can often interfere with thinking. For Americans, talking helps thinking. We think of them, they go together. They're part and parcel of the same exercise. She did something like this. She gave a series of problems that looked like this. This is a Raven's progressive matrix test. It's supposed to be culture fair. And she had people perform this in one of two conditions, either a condition in which you talked out loud or a condition in which you solved the problem in silence. And what you can see is that for the Asian Americans, they solved many more problems when they were silent. Talking really interfered. Talking while they were solving the problems got in the way of good problem solving. That was not the case for those in the blue bars, the European Americans. So, and many other studies like this, empirical evidence that in the East, talking and thinking are separate activities. They're not the same thing. And the idea that talking, expressing yourself, putting your hand up and giving your opinion and saying what you think, that might not be the only way to be a smart person. Shocking. The independent self, as I've said now, is the default self. And what you see in Silicon Valley, where I'm from, is many, many comments like this from Asian Americans who experience what we call the bamboo ceiling. And that's people who say, I didn't get the position. I was told I didn't have the executive presence that would allow me to command the table. So those are two things that independent selves need to do. And in contexts that foster an independent self and don't have much awareness of another way of being, this is a sign that you just don't have the right stuff. So let me move now to another divide, and that's between the middle class and the working class. This is another interdependence divide. And the US middle class culture cycles foster independence. Working class culture cycles foster that because they're within the US, which fosters independence, but they also foster a lot of interdependence. And in fact, social classes can be indicated in multiple ways, but educational attainment is one particularly good way to do it. We are, in the US, a working class nation. 68% of Americans don't have a college education, so by definition, that makes them working class. That means that the majority of people in America are likely to have more experience with interdependence and an interdependent way of being than have experience with an independent way of being. And so that should give us some pause when we start thinking about what to do in our various settings. You can see that if you don't have a college degree, the most obvious thing is you're going to earn less money. This is weekly earnings. Less money, less education means many different things. It means more dense, multiplex social networks where everybody knows each other. You spend more time with your family and longtime friends. You're much less likely to move. That's what happens when people go away to college. Then you get more dispersed networks. You work jobs with less choice and control. You teach your children to fit in, to observe hierarchy, to follow tradition. All parents want to do the best they can for their kids, but if you know that you are socializing children to go into a world where things will be less structured and less safe, it's important to teach your offspring that they should follow the rules and observe hierarchy. With less money and less education, you're going to be in worlds with fewer choices or less attractive choices, and as a result, you're going to develop this more interdependent self. And what do we know about the culture cycles of more interdependent selves? First of all, in the independent self, as we've said, the focus is on what's in that blue part there, your special qualities. And how you show that you are a good self is through your accomplishments, through your individual successes and achievements. In the middle class, that's much less, working class, that's much less likely to be the case. Much more emphasis on being part of a like-minded group, a family, a team, or a community. Now, as we saw in here, many people are bicultural when it comes to class. But when you're coming from a working class background, if you were the first person in your family to go to college, for example, you're likely to experience this clash. And as we build positive organizations, awareness of these different ways of being and accommodating them can be a very useful thing to do. Let me just show you, we gave a variety of scenarios to middle class and working class respondents. Here's an example of one, Stephen and the drunk uncle. You may have experienced this kind of problem. Stephen has an uncle who has become increasingly hot-headed at recent family events. He tends to drink too much and has clashed with Stephen on several occasions. A year ago, Stephen got engaged, and as his wedding day comes closer, he's unsure he wants his uncle to come to the event. What should he do? People have probably had some kind of experience like this, okay? What you see, two different answers. Working class participant says family is family. Unfortunately, he has to invite his uncle, but it would be good if he could have a conversation about him because he doesn't want him to disturb his wedding. But if he doesn't, there would be bad blood. A very common middle class response is he should not invite his uncle. People aren't important just because they're family. Move on. So what we see in the class divide is a very different understanding of relationships. In the middle class, relationships are seen as choices, as volitional. In the middle class, a much more interdependent understanding, more familiarity with that way of being. Once you have a relationship, you have a relationship. You're interdependent with that. You're tied to that relationship. In a series of vignettes, series of studies, we can, oh, that's, okay, I'll try another. What thing happened there? Did I touch something? Well, I want to talk about what happens when working class students come to, who are the first in their family to come to the university. They experience a clash. And, oh, I should show you that this pen choice study that I showed you before, when you give this to working class respondents, they actually respond more like the data I showed you from the East Asians, a sense of this more interdependent self, the sense of wanting to be fit in, to wanting to be in the majority. I'll show you this example too. Suppose that you do a lot of research and you go buy a new car for yourself. It's a very Bay Area car, a red Prius. And you show it to your friend, and then the next day you find out that your friend went out and bought the exact same car. Okay, how do you feel? How many people feel bad? A few feel bad. Okay, so you're more like this person, which was common among the middle class respondents who said, I'd be disappointed because I want to be unique. It spoils my fun and my point of differentiation. Working class respondent says, yeah, I want to do this. Let's start a car club. And I think the comment earlier about where we are is you see that in the Midwest is much more likely to have experience with interdependence and have a very more developed interdependent self. When I do this in Palo Alto, everybody's upset if their friend buys the same car. I mean, it couldn't be a larger cultural difference than that. Let's talk about what happens when at the university. When first gens enter college, you start to see across the nation a big social class achievement gap. You get higher dropout rates, worse grades. First gen students interact less with professors. They make fewer friends. Michelle Obama was herself a first generation student. She said it really well when she went to Princeton. She went to one of our elite universities and she said, there's a whole new world here. You might have trouble making friends because you don't see any peers who come from background like yours. You might be feeling guilty when you call home because mom and dad are wondering why you didn't get a job so you could help support their family. Another student said, I want to go to college not just to get there, not just for individual accomplishment, but to really learn something so I can give back, a much more interdependent motive for going to college. It's not about me and my success, but about what I can do with it. Another student says, I was mostly keeping to myself to hide the fact that at university I was a very special kind of lost. While my college had done an excellent job recruiting me, I had no roadmap for what I was supposed to do once I made it to campus. And I found that example really interesting because when I look at Stanford, who recruits about 25% first-gen students, and you look on the website, first of all, the Stanford motto is the wind of freedom blows. And then when you read into the website, it says, it is not the task, first and foremost, of an academic advisor to tell you what to do. Your advisor should be seen as a compass, pointing to true north, not as a roadmap. So the very thing that this poor student was asking for, a roadmap, the university was very proudly asserting that it wasn't going to be a roadmap. But of course, if you're the first in your family to go to college, you really might like someone, enjoy someone guiding what could be done. So now I just want to show you quickly a few different ways in which at the university we have been working to promote interdependence, to soften clashes, and to enhance motivation, performance, creativity. There's many different strategies that can be employed. Many of them I think that you've heard from and about from people in the Positive Links groups. You can include and welcome interdependence. You can foster a sense of belongingness and connection. You can really try to normalize the clash that will happen to anybody and try to give some guidance about what to do about it. In one laboratory study, we brought first-gen students and continuing generation students into the lab, had them work on a series of problems. Before doing that, we had them read a letter that was sent by then President Hennessy, which describes Stanford. It's a very independent letter. As you can see, it says, I'm delighted you have decided to come here and that you'll have a chance for personal exploration and charting your own path. We took the same letter and tweaked it in an interdependent direction, saying we're really happy that you and your family have decided that you should come to Stanford. And here you're going to be able to learn from others, collaborate with peers, just giving it more of an interdependent sense, letting students know that they could use their interdependent self here at Stanford. And what you can see, this is just one of many problem-solving tasks. You have a big gap between students over here on the left, we're going ahead here, sorry. Over here on the left, when Stanford is framed as a place of independence, when Stanford is framed as a place that you can also use your interdependent self that allows cooperation, collaboration, cares about relationality, you can see that this gap between first gens and continuing gens disappears. And of course, the gap shouldn't be there because first gen students are recruited with the same scores and the same grades as the continuing gen. So let me tell you then about another recent study that just we're getting results on. This is, we've followed students over 4 years. When they were matriculating in 2012, we had them read paragraphs that we based on comments from other students who had been first-generation students coming to the university. We had them read 6 paragraphs as part of their matriculation materials. And then we had a randomized control study. We had the other half of incoming students read about a series of study tips. So this is one of the paragraphs we had students read, and there were 6 like this. This person says, even before I came to Stanford, freshman year, I knew I would have a lot of freedom to choose what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be, what classes to take, what to major in, what activities to do. It's wonderful to have that kind of freedom, but it's also a burden. Being a first-generation student, there are some things I couldn't ask. I couldn't ask my family. No, they couldn't help me. They didn't know the difference between one class and another. And then it goes on, it says, it shows students that there will be this clash, that the clash is normative, they should expect it. But then, in these paragraphs, we also gave them a clue about what they could do. I learned that you can't do it on your own, but if you ask for help, there are people here who can do that. So there were 6 variations of that, and this was compared to 6 variations of different study tips. We followed them now for 4 years. And this is just one graph. What you can see is that this interdependence manipulation, it improved first-generation grades, and it improved first-generation students' campus integration quite significantly. And that was the only thing that was done at the beginning of their freshman year as part of a lot of materials and questionnaires that they filled out to come to the university. So letting first-generation students know that there was this possibility of a clash between their experience that they'd had and what they would find, but that it could be solved, and giving them some strategies to do that. Okay, I show you just one other. I want to have time for questions here. This was another study that we did with African American first-generation students, and to help, in this case, what we did is to tell students that they were going to have the opportunity to take one of several classes, new classes being developed at the university. One class was on African American history and culture, and they read an elaborate website about this new course, and it included lots of positive representations of African American life and experience. And then the other condition was a class about European American culture and history, and included many positive representations of European American history and culture. And this was a study that was done with African American students and mainstream white students. And what you can see is that the African American students, this was a test of creativity, actually performed much better when they were in the condition in which they understood that the university was to offer this course, which was about African American history and culture, and included a set of positive representations, quotes from various prominent African Americans who would be featured in the class. It was a sort of a simple thing of inclusion, which tells people that they belong, that who they are matters, and their group is held in high esteem, which is something that rarely happens in many of our mainstream universities. So just to finish up now, so we have time for questions, I've been doing a lot of work on making tweaks in my own workplace to include more interdependence, but I've been working with many colleagues, particularly a former student, Nicole Stevens, who's a professor at Kellogg, looking at how class and this class divide continues on into the workplace. And it's clear that most workplaces still are rooted in an independent self and have very little awareness of it, or at least explicit awareness of it. Just one ad, this is from Deloitte. What's great about people, each person is unique and valued for that, among the best and brightest in the business, and takes pride in their achievements. It's just this same message that Stanford University gives about the right way to be a self. And of course, what you find is many people, even when they've gone through and had a college education, are not comfortable with self-promotion. And self-promotion, expressing yourself and your ideas and saying what matters to you, is particularly important in independent contexts. And you need a lot of practice before you're comfortable with that. And you can see that it's not only difficulty with discomfort with self-promotion that continues, but feelings of inauthenticity for many people who have come from working class backgrounds that find themselves in very independent working settings, difficulty with social networking, a lower degree of entitlement. All of this leads to lots of things like no credit for ideas, one's contributions go unseen, fewer promotion opportunities. And so my colleagues at Kellogg are working on various interventions to smooth this transition at the workplace, even after college. So I will just, I think I'm just going to show you this because I want to have time for questions. Going back to the culture cycle, I think what we can do is bridge many of these divides, and I only had time to just talk about 2 of them quickly, with interdependence. And I have a series of suggestions from what can be done to bridge these divides at all different levels of the culture cycle. At the ideas level, it's very important to highlight interdependence in all of your materials that communicate, websites, mission statements. You can bridge divides at the individual level. Very importantly there, it's promoting leaders, choosing leaders who are interdependence experts, who know what interdependence is and why it matters. At the interaction levels, you have to provide people with opportunities to connect and broaden their social networks. You can design activities in various ways so people get to practice both their independent and their interdependent selves. You can set up situations so that everybody's voice can be heard, maybe through writing, maybe through requiring everyone to speak, and can discourage interruptions. There's just many, many techniques, and I'd be glad to talk about them. And of course, at the individual level, there's so many things that can be done. Simple things, connecting with people, just knowing people's names, and of course, asking questions, finding out about people's background, actively listening to the answers. The general idea that adjusting to others, at least part of the time, it's not a weakness. It doesn't mean that your ego boundaries are not sharp. You know, it's an okay thing to do when you're using your interdependent self. It really can help promote a lot of positive feeling. In classes, in workplaces, the idea of providing the necessary cultural capital, detailed, specific information is often the only thing that people need to get the job done well, but we very often don't do that. High expectations, being patient, emphasizing similarities, so many, many different things. But I think at that point, so we can have some questions, I'll stop. Nothing I said today would be possible, could I say, without, you know, a whole village, multiple villages of collaborators that I've been very, very fortunate to work with. Thank you for your attention. Please, questions? Yes. Hi, Katie. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's a fantastic talk. It resonated with me personally as well. I wondered what you think about how these cultural elements play out in a world that is rapidly globalizing. For example, some people say the world is actually expanding because we're including these elements in previously what we thought of as monocultural environment. But other people argue that the world is actually flattening with 78 countries becoming more and more independent across the world. It's homogenizing in the way that Asian cultures are westernizing. Actually, a lot of non-Western cultures are looking to Western ways of being. Everybody knows about Hollywood. Nobody knows about Bollywood or Nollywood. You see fast food chains, KFC, more of them in China than in the United States. People are dressing in Western ways. And nowadays, people also have a Kim Kardashian-like Asian show called Richie White Asians, Richie ultra-rich Asians. That the Asians we have nowadays are very different from the Asians we have 20 years ago. That non-Westerners may also be suffering from the modern ethos of overconfidence and self-absorption. So I wonder if you can kind of talk about where do you see the future going in terms of integrating cultural elements, but also the independent ways of being, the Western ways of being, middle class and men, they are also the groups with the most status and cultural capital. And where do you see this kind of imbalance playing out?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, what's happening where there's more and more creolization of different cultures coming into contact with each other, but that's happening among the urban elite of the world, and that's wonderful. You know, in Beijing, many people do psychotherapy with New York City psychotherapists now. You know, yes, we have all of this happening, but still, 85% of the world is operating from a different model of how to be a self than the one that we know well in our social sciences, and we just need to have much more information about that. And of course, there's billions of differences there, but I would say that one way that provides some inroad into it, some window to what else is going on, all the contexts that aren't weird, is to be aware of interdependence. And of course, you know, East Asian interdependence is not working class American interdependence, but they share some features which has to do with the importance of relationality, the importance of social responsiveness, the importance of being aware of yourself in hierarchy, and of recognizing that relationships are not choices. You are born into relationships, and you have to adjust and accommodate to them, whatever those groups are. And I think if we don't get that understanding, we are seriously even more at risk than I think we already think we are of the clashes in the world. So I think, yes, you're right, but also we must have much more evidence on the interdependent world, the non-weird world. Yeah, yes, please.
Hi, thank you for coming in today. My question is, how do you encourage interdependence in the workplace or in college institutions or wherever without also encouraging cliques or like silos as a byproduct as well?
Well, that's a really good question, how you can encourage independence and interdependence without, you know, having people in their kind of segregated areas. That's always what we worry about. I think the importance is recognizing that these are both aspects of human being, of human flourishing, and recognizing both of them as assets, and recognizing that the people who are going to thrive in the multicultural world are those people that have both of those selves and know how to deploy both of these selves in the proper situation. So I'd say the answer to your question is spending a lot more time showing what are the assets of an interdependent self. Those are resources, a lot that you learn being part of a working class context you bring into it. So we need to light that up in various ways. And of course, I think there are increasingly, with all the good upsides of individualism, there are many downsides of individualism too, and if I had time we could talk about those. So I think we just need to make that clear, but it's a really good question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for more conversations at the reception. So thank you so much for coming here and giving this wonderful talk today. You're such an inspiration for a lot of us. And as a tradition, on behalf of the center, I have a small token of appreciation. It's a positive spiral. Oh. So thank you so much for coming here. Please give her another round of applause. That's lovely. Thank you.